This is a good story to record just for your family. Anyway, Jesse Wright. My dad comes to Chittenden in 39, and he runs into this guy named Jesse Wright. And back then, Jesse Wright had come to Alaska in the 20s. And he's just a young kid, and he'd been trapping. And all he wanted to do was trap, hardcore trap. So he goes, he's talking to my dad, and he's telling, later on in life, he's telling my dad a story. My dad, before the highway came through here, it was in Chittenden, and then they put the highway through in 41 or 42 during the war. And so Jesse was telling them about some of the stories about this part of the country. He says, yeah, first time I ever went trapping, he says, there was only a couple airplanes in the whole territory, and one of them was out of Valdez. So he says, I wanted to go trapping at Lake Louise. And he says, I thought that'd be a real good place to trap. And Dad goes, yeah, so what about that? And he goes, well, he said, I hired a plane and all my gear and everything. And he says, those old planes would fly pretty slow, actually. You know, they had a lot of wing and everything. And he says, we flew around, and he says, the only place on Lake Louise, he says, there was no Indians, no Aten Indians living there anymore. I didn't even know if they came up to Berry Pick or whatever, because they used that area a lot for, the Indians did, the Copper River Indians, because they mixed their berries and their fish. And he says, there was nobody on the lake, there was nothing there, no civilization at all. And he says, the only place that I wanted to be on this point out there, he says, with nothing but overflow that year. And so he says, the guys find a plane. He says, he made 2 or 3 passes. He says, I can't land here. He says, well, he says, I'm not going to drag my gear on. He says, I got to land here somewhere. So he says, they opened up the rear door on this big old radio plane. And every time he'd drive past the area, he'd dump stuff out right next to the beach there where the overflow was, but it was kind of on shore. And he says, going around, and he goes, well, what do you think? And he says, I can't. He says, I still can't find anywhere to land you. And he says, you're going to have a walk. And he says, well, if you can slow fly this thing down to about 42 miles an hour, I'm going to just dive out. And so he goes, okay. And so he comes down as low as he can get without landing. And they go by, and he dives out the back door into the snowbank, and he flies around to give him, I guess he gives him a thumbs up or something. And he spent the whole winter there trapping, and he got a big handmade a sled and everything, just like the early Indians. And when he was done, before everything broke up in the springtime, he loaded up this handmade sled and hand pulled it all the way down over to the Madanuska and went down the Madanuska, not to Palmer, it wasn't there, to Madanuska Station. Huh. And Madanuska Station was in the area where the experimental farms were for Palmer at that time. And that was the end of that part of the story. Except that Dad always talked about Jesse Wright. He was 7-day Adventist, really nice, really a great guy. And Dad just, you know, he and Dad really hit it off. Well, here's the story that'll, you know, I always grew up about hearing Jesse Wright. I thought Jesse Wright had been gone for like 50 years. So I'm up at the barn, okay, and this has been quite a few years ago, and a guy shows up in an old beat-up truck with a camper on the back, and he looks like about a 90-year-old man. And I come driving up in my Jeep, and he's got this gal with him that's about 17, and she's just drop-dead gorgeous. And I'm going, what in the world's going on here? And I says, you know, because we kind of controlled the road up to the barn there, and I says, can I help you out? He says, yeah, he says, 50, 60 years ago, I used to climb up on this mountain and look for these little agate things and all kinds of stuff. Well, that was cool. And he says, I'm going to go up there and look for fossils. And he says, this was always a good area for fossils and little rocks and everything. And he says, I make jewelry and everything. I said, where are you from? He says, I'm from North Carolina. And he says, this is my granddaughter. And he says, we decided to drive up here and look at some of the old stuff I used to do and all that. And we went on to talk for 15 minutes. And I go, man, you sound like you've been around a lot of the same stuff I have. I said, what's your name? And he says, Jesse Wright. I said, Jesse Wright? My dad's old friend that that dove out of an airplane, the first man to ever build a cabin on Lake Louise. He was the first guy that built a cabin on Lake Louise, and it was Jesse Wright. And so that's part of Alaskan history through this part of the country. And Jesse Wright was a real deal. And he took his granddaughter. I haven't ever seen him since. He sent me a letter once, and I don't know what, I can't remember what he said about it. His name was on there and all that. But he took all the stuff off anthracite, and he'd go back and he'd make little jewelry and all kinds of stuff out of it.
Huh.
And he guided, I said, what did you do all your life? He guided, what's the main valley coming from Fairbanks down this way that goes way up into the south side? The main one that everybody, Wood River. I said, what did you do?
Wood River.
He goes, I guided
serious.
most of my life up until I was 70s in the Wood River.
Huh.
That's what he did all of his life. He guided.
That's hardcore country up there.
Yeah, he guided. In the
Used
Wood
to be.
Well, yeah, you know.
Now it's every Tom, Dick, and Harry goes up there with their boats.
Yeah.